all for coming out tonight and hearing about our women today. So before I get started, I do need to give a content warning. Some of these women committed some pretty horrific things, and they also endured some pretty horrific things. This includes, but not limited to, abortion, sexual assault, and murder. This will be entirely about our female residents here who spent their time here. Their crimes are on a spectrum from bad checks, prostitution, to murder. Women committed an array of crimes similar to men, but were treated much differently. So before we get into the women officially, it's necessary to understand a bit about the buildings here. Here at the penitentiary, the territorial prison was built in 1870, and when it was initially built, it was built to house 42 men. When it was first built, like I said, in 1870, there weren't that many white settlers here in the Oregon Territory, which is now Idaho. But with western expansion, the gold rush, and Oregon Trail, this created an influx of people moving out west. With this, we had more outlaws, bandits, and lawbreakers, and there quickly needed a solution for this, so the territorial prison was built. The very first woman is also housed here in the territorial prison, and her name is Henneby. Very little is known about her. For instance, how to pronounce her name. According to some documents, her name is Henneba. So some records we have written about her, like I say, are difficult to understand, mostly because they're so old, and I'll get into a little bit of the more of the reasons a little bit later. But we do know that she was a Bannock Shoshone native, and the facts that we do have are based off her Bertillon. Her Bertillon states that she is 5 foot 3 inches. She was 27 years old upon her arrival here, and both her hair and her eye color are described as black. This is very common in records written for Indigenous people during this time. This will later change to brown in the 20th century. So the reason very little is known about her is that during this period, records were greatly marred by the perspective of the white record keepers. Also, the records that we do have greatly reflect the tumultuous relationships between Native Americans and white settlers. Additionally, prior to the 1890s, no one received mugshots here at the penitentiary. The very first 3 women who were incarcerated here did not get their mugshots done. Henneby was charged and convicted of meme-loosing her husband in 1887. Meme-loosing is a very outdated term for a Native American killing another Native American. However, it is also referred to as manslaughter, and she's sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison. When she first arrives here at the site, there's a meeting between prison officials to discuss what to do with Henneby, as she is the only woman in the facility. They determined it would be best for her to work in the warden's home rather than out in the yard with the men. It is unclear if this officially happened. We infer that most likely she worked inside the warden's home or doing a less strenuous job around the site. After about 5 months into her sentence, Henneby escapes from the prison. One evening, she was sent out into the yard to retrieve a bucket by a guard. A bucket was most likely used to go to the bathroom in during this time. When she climbed over the wall and escaped into the foothills, there was about a 12-foot wooden fence around the perimeter of the territorial building during this time. A newspaper detailing her escape said that she had climbed over the wall as one would a bear. This points back to how Indigenous people were viewed during this time. Keep in mind, this is 1887 when this is written. There's a $50 reward for her capture and a $25 incentive for information leading to her capture, and about 10 days later, Henneby is recaptured in the Fort Hall Reservation about 240 miles away. It is presumed that she would have walked those 240 miles. Native police would have returned her, and she was released after serving a total of 1 year. After Henneby, the next location for women is going to be the 1890 cell house. It's the first building that was built using incarcerated labor here at the site. It's also home to the very first death row. This is also where the prison transferred from territorial regulation to a state prison, as this is the year that Idaho officially became a state in 1890. So when the 1890 cell house was initially built, the women's ward is created in the back section of the cell house. When the cell house was first built, the back section was initially created to be the officer's barber shop. However, as more women served time here, they created a separate area to house the women. 8 women would serve time in the 1890 cell house before the official women's ward that we see today was actually created. Initially, having men and women integrated in the same cell house outraged the community. It's important to note there were few women here in Boise, let alone Idaho, when it became a territory in 1868. So there wasn't much of a need to create a separate women's portion in a prison. For instance, in 1890, the same year the cell house was built, and the same year Idaho became a state, the male population in Wallace, Idaho outnumbered the female population by a ratio of 200 to 1. So for every 200 men, there was 1 woman in Wallace, Idaho. Mostly men came out west in search of jobs, while some came out as wives and daughters of these men. Others came out west looking for better opportunities. The majority of women here during this time, though, would have been indigenous. Josie Kersler is going to be one of the first women to serve time here at the penitentiary. She is described as beautiful by all accounts in newspapers and different outlets. And when she's 14, she is married to a man who is 28, so 14 years her senior. In 1896, when Josie was 24 years old, she was living with her husband on her husband's farm, and the two of them had 2 children together. She was having an affair with the family's farmhand, Alfred Friel. After Josie's husband mysteriously goes missing, after heading into town, parts of his coat, his pipe, and even his wagon are found strewn about the roads. Kersler's husband is missing. About 2 months after he goes missing, Kersler's husband's body is discovered by the family dog in an irrigation ditch. He had been shot and killed. Although pleading not guilty, both Kersler and Friel were charged with murder. Kersler was sentenced to life in prison, serving for murder in the 2nd degree. Josie was pregnant upon the time of her arrival here. After she gave birth, her daughter would have been sent to live with Kersler's sister-in-law. We know of at least 10 women to have given birth while incarcerated here, all of which would have given birth outside of the facility. It is somewhat disputed if Josie Kersler had given birth outside of the facility at St. Luke's or if she gave birth here on site. Our best inference is that she would have given birth outside of the facility at a hospital. So I'm going to give one more brief content warning before I get into this next part of her story, because it does include sexual assault and an alleged abortion. So Kersler is the only woman for much of the time that she spent here. While there was a separate area for women, she was still housed in the same facility as men. In 1902, Kersler goes to the warden telling him that she is pregnant. Keep in mind, this is 5 years into her sentence. Josie claimed that a guard had impregnated her. The warden, Charles Arney, ordered the penitentiary physician to give Josie a physical examination. After the examination, he did determine that she was in fact pregnant. The penitentiary physician then performed an abortion on Josie without her consent. Kersler accused Charles Arney of being responsible for the abortion, and she wanted to take their actions to court. The deputy warden, James Donnelly, then promised her a pardon if she had testified contradicting her previous accusation. So she did so. Keep in mind, I should also point out that her daughter, who she had given birth to upon her arrival, is about 5 years old during this time. So the cases against the men were dropped. However, Donnelly did not hold to his promise, and she was not pardoned until 1909, 7 years after this initially occurred. She ended up serving a total of 12 and a half years. So while the public was enraged with Josie's story and the scandal that had occurred, Ida Laherty is seen as a straw that broke the camel's back regarding women being housed in the same facility as men. She is charged with grand larceny in 1903. She served time inside the 1890 cell house. Her time would have overlapped with Josie Kersler. Kersler would take Laherty on supervised walks around the site since she was the only other woman on site during the time. Ida had stolen a team of horses with her boyfriend in Washington. She had taken them across state lines, waiting to meet her boyfriend here in Idaho, but her boyfriend did not meet her. Instead, she is caught, and she's charged with grand larceny. She's sentenced to 1 year here at the penitentiary. Ida was known to be very feisty, and she's described as ill-mannered by the guards here. But her case sparked outrage as she was only 16, serving time in the same facility as grown men. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union petitioned the governor to grant her a pardon, as she was a scandal waiting to happen. Ida was pardoned after serving 3 months in total. Susie Duffy is going to be another young woman that served time here. Duffy was charged with grand larceny in 1903, the same year and the same crime as Ida Laherty. The two of them have many parallels in their story, and their time would have overlapped at some point. However, we do see some stark differences between their two outcomes. As I previously mentioned, Duffy was charged and convicted of grand larceny for stealing just over $1,000 from a man. She was sentenced to 3 years at the penitentiary when she was just 17 years old. A year into her sentence, Duffy received a pardon which came as a result from the penitentiary physician. In an article from the Idaho Daily Statesman, they write that her condition is such that little is held out for her recovery. She is suffering from a severe case of consumption or tuberculosis and would not get better under the care of the physician here at the penitentiary. So they offer her a pardon. The only condition, though, is that her family does not live here in Idaho. They are from Kansas City. She would also have to pay for her own way home. So the entire African American community here in Boise, which made up of less than 1% of the total population, raised money to afford Duffy a ticket back home to Kansas City. We don't know what happened to Duffy upon her release. We don't know if she made it home or not. It will never be clear, but we do know that her community did stand by her side during this tumultuous time. So, in 1905, the official women's ward is created, the thing that we still see today. Women were moved out to the old warden's home, and a stone wall was built around the vicinity, thus created, like I said, the very first official women's ward. Inside, women were allowed to wear their outside clothes, prepare their own meals, and play cards with one another. The ward could hold up to about 16 women, 2 in each cell. There's 7 cells. And during times of overpopulation, there might be women who had trustee status, or whoever was there the longest would sleep out in the bunk in the day room. The vast majority were never given access to vocational training or education. This is important to note, as most occupations women gave upon their arrival, gave upon their intake forms, would have been housewife, homekeeper, and maid, amongst other domestic occupations. While we did certainly have a large number of women who had other jobs, such as nurses, court clerks, or teachers, most women did not have any sort of economic freedom, meaning they had to depend upon their husbands or a man to earn money or to have a livable income. This, of course, would reinforce the cycle of economic dependence of women onto men. This then resulted in men mistreating, abusing, or tormenting their wives, since women had little opportunity to work for themselves. Of course, when a woman does leave her husband or she's widowed, she is left with little to no means to support herself, let alone her family. Alta McGee is an example of this. In 1907, her husband began flaunting new women to Alta in front of her. He would drive his carriage in front of her home, knowing that she was inside, and Alta would see him with another woman. Her husband claims that Alta had been seeing other men first and flaunting these men in front of him. We don't know if this is true. There's no evidence that points to that being true. However, we do have evidence of her husband flaunting women. Alta had eventually had enough. She went outside to where her husband and the other women were, dragged the woman out of the carriage, and beat her with a horsewhip. This newspaper behind me says, "Whipped young woman who was out with her husband and also takes care of herself against great odds." There is a lot of sympathy for Alta and for women who are experiencing similar situations. Of course, this did not stop her husband. In 1908, I should mention, she paid a $5 fine for the assault. This did not stop her husband, though. And in 1908, after he was driving up and down their street with another woman, the other woman had actually done so much as even call Alta, telling her that she was going to steal her husband. Eventually, this made Alta snap. She decided she was going to rent her own carriage, and she went downtown and searched for him with a revolver in her lap. She found her husband with the other woman and shot at him 3 times. Although she missed all 3 times, she claimed that every shot was meant to hit him, she just kept missing. This is Idaho's alleged first drive-by shooting. She then claimed that her husband wanted her to join a blackmailing scheme where Alta would seduce men and then used their infidelity as a way to blackmail them, and that is why she shot at him. No evidence points to this being true. She was arrested and she was charged with assault with a deadly weapon, and she was sentenced to 10 months here at the facility. But the public, as well as the warden, had much sympathy for her, and the governor had granted her a respite after serving just 3 months. So while Alta and other women that I'll discuss in future slides committed acts of violence to get them here at the penitentiary, the majority were in here for theft. Many women would have committed theft out of necessity. They were not granted economic freedom, and it was much harder for women to support their families, let alone themselves, without a husband or a man to do so. Therefore, like I had previously mentioned, when a woman did leave their husbands or if they became widowed, some turned to crime to make ends meet. Other crimes include moral crimes like adultery, the spread of venereal disease, induction to prostitution, and breaking prohibition laws. Others include petty crimes. This includes insufficient funds, forgery, obtaining money under the false pretenses. Some of these, of course, might fall under what might be deemed a theft of necessity. And while we certainly had women who stole for a life of luxury or for no known reason, many did so out of desperation. Crimes labeled as other might be escaping the prison or escaping a jail, arson, or damage to a cell. These may have occurred while serving time in either a county jail or here at the penitentiary. So those who did commit acts of violence were charged far more leniently compared to men. This is because women were deemed incapable of planning and committing acts of violence. For a large portion that the site was open, the cultural view of women was very childlike. So when a woman did commit an act of violence, it was more likely to be viewed that she was mentally ill or suffering from something rather than calculated and manipulative. On the flip side, women who were here on moral crimes are viewed as a little bit more heinously. This is because women are viewed as the mothers of the home, the backbone of the home, the gentle sex. So when a woman did commit a moral crime, they were treated a little bit more harshly than men for similar crimes. Rebecca Chacon is going to be another woman who represents a violent crime committed by a woman. Rebecca was born in Mexico, and by the 1920s, she had immigrated to Pocatello, Idaho. Hispanic people have always lived in Idaho since the territorial days. Pocatello was home to a very large portion of Hispanic individuals and had a very rich culture. In Pocatello, Rebecca meets a man named Pedro, and the two of them begin a relationship. Pedro is married at the time and allegedly in the midst of a divorce. Rebecca then meets J.M. Chacon. He's a very prominent figure in Pocatello, and he's almost 30 years her senior. The two of them get married, and Pedro reconciles with his wife. Rebecca and J.M. then attend a party that Pedro and his wife are also attending. It's important to point out that these two couples are at odds with each other. This stems from Rebecca and Pedro's relationship. Idaho is also, I should point out, Idaho is in a midst of prohibition during this time, and has this party has a supply of moonshine and liquor, and the attendees are reported by various media to be intoxicated when this occurs. Pedro and Rebecca begin to fight. It is unclear what about. Some sources say it was Rebecca trying to get Pedro back. Others say it was Pedro trying to get Rebecca back. We don't know the true motive of what the fight started as. However, it does escalate, and she pulls out a gun and she shoots Pedro 3 times. Her husband, J.M., jumps into the fight and shoots Pedro in the head. Pedro's wife pulls out her gun. Rebecca attempts to shoot her, but accidentally shoots her husband, J.M. So Pedro, at the end of the fight, Pedro is dead upon arrival. J.M. was shot in the torso, and he was laying on the ground when the police eventually arrived. Pedro's wife flees the scene. She is not a part. She leaves pretty quickly. So J.M. is charged with murder in the first degree and sentenced to life, and Rebecca is charged with murder in the second degree and sentenced to 25 to 50 years. Rebecca is the only Mexican-born woman to serve time here at the penitentiary, and about 2 years into her sentence, she's given a conditional pardon. The condition, though, is that she must be deported back to Mexico at her own expense. J.M. is also paroled after about 2 years, but he is an American citizen, so he did not face deportation. Women of color faced significant adversity compared to their white peers. While women of color represented a minority of the population in Idaho, we do see a disproportionate representation of them here at the Idaho Penitentiary. Rebecca, as well as Susie Duffy, that I previously mentioned, serve as examples of this. So Mary Beatty and Alice Neighbor are going to represent moral crimes women might have committed to serve time here. So Mary Beatty and Alice Neighbor, Mary Beatty, her husband is charged and convicted of rape. He's sent here to the Idaho Penitentiary, and she's left alone to care for herself and their 3 small children, only earning $20 a month for their support, to support her family. She had no additional means of financial support. So she then moved in with her mother, Alice Neighbor. In the early hours of March 9th, 1922, police raided Neighbor's home to find both Mary and Alice in bed with men that were not their husbands. All 4 parties were charged with adultery and sent to the Idaho Penitentiary. Her children would have been sent to the Boise's Children Home, and I want to note that a majority of women who served time here were mothers. And like I previously mentioned, we know of at least 10 women who entered the ward pregnant. Both Mary and Alice were sentenced to 6 months to 3 years. Mary was paroled after about 6 months. She was pregnant upon her arrival here, and could be inferred that she was released so that she could have her child outside of the prison and then return to her children who were staying at the Boise's Children Home. So women also worked here at the penitentiary. They also worked here at the penitentiary. While there were very few female guards here at the penitentiary, few being hired as part of an experiment to test the new rehabilitation program to re-socialize residents in 1973. Matrons were a very large part of the facility here. Matrons were often the wives of the wardens. Nurses were also hired to fill these positions. Lulu Rowan was the matron of the women's ward from 1961 to 1967. Here she wore many hats. She was a licensed practical nurse. She worked as a counselor for the women, helped them with rehabilitation and re-entry into society, and she supervised them on a day-to-day basis. Lulu Rowan offers some great insight into the women's ward. There are still many questions regarding this site, and especially the women's ward. So when we do have these interviews, it does offer a lot of great insight. So, like in an interview done with Lulu Rowan, done in the 80s, she discusses some of the day-to-day activities the women might have done. Most of them did crafts, either knitting, crocheting, or sewing. Women were allowed to sew their own garments, their own clothes. Lulu says that they would pick out a pattern, then Lulu would go to commissary and receive the fabric needed, and then they would spend the rest of their day sewing. They did not have many job opportunities for women, like they did for the men who served time here. But one job that they did have was washing the clothes of the guards. They would receive 15 cents for long sleeve shirts, and then 10 cents for short sleeve shirts. With the money that they were earning, they were allowed to buy from commissary. They were allotted $5 a month from their bookings to spend. Lulu shares that the majority of this money was spent on cosmetics, yarn, and fabric. Women were allowed to wear makeup within the facility, and they were allowed to do their hair. In some pictures that we'll see and that will be behind me, you'll see that they don't necessarily look what you might imagine a resident to look like. They're going to be wearing dresses. They're going to have their hair done. It looks very different. So at one point, the ward would hold up to about 16 women, like I said, with a capacity of 16. Although there were still times matrons were only looking after one woman, in times where women weren't being incarcerated in Idaho. While Lulu mentions and records show that there was little opportunity for vocational training while incarcerated, this does not mean it never happened. Lulu mentions that typing was a skill learned by some women who were incarcerated, and during Lulu's time as matron, a woman was able to finish her schooling in cosmetology while incarcerated. So Yanda King. Yanda King was 18 years old when she was arrested for robbery in 1964. She, as well as some friends, stole a purse from an elderly woman. During the robbery, the elderly woman had fallen to the ground. She, as well as her accomplices, were charged and convicted of robbery. King was sentenced to 5 years at the state penitentiary for this crime. Prior to her incarceration, though, Yanda King was enrolled at Mr. Nick's beauty school. Mr. Nick, the director of the cosmetology school, wrote to the warden, Lou Clapp, asking if Yanda King could continue her schooling while incarcerated. Mr. Nick asked the warden if he could send Yanda a mannequin head, cosmetology books, a comb, a hairbrush, hair clips, and a waving lotion to further her education. Warden Clapp allows this, stating that he is happy to cooperate as long as no lotions or beauty supplies contain alcohol. They are allowed to be sent in. King was able to continue her schooling during her incarceration, practicing on not only the mannequin head, but as well as the other female residents who were serving time with her. She was paroled after serving just under 2 years at the penitentiary. So while most women did not receive vocational training or education like the men, King shows that it was possible to continue education during a time where it seemed difficult or even impossible. As we're getting close to the end, we'll end with Idaho's alleged first serial killer, Lia Souther. Lia is marries her first husband in 1912. Soon, tragedy strikes when her husband, her daughter, and her brother-in-law all die within a short period of 1915. Lia gets married 3 more times within the span of about 6 years. The time in which she gets remarried keeps getting shorter and shorter, and the time in which her husband dies keeps getting shorter and shorter. After her 4th husband's death, Lia moves to California. However, the Twin Falls County Sheriff found it quite odd that Lia had attracted such bad luck. So he also found out that Lia had collected nearly $10,000 from her late husbands. Adjusted to inflation into modern currency, this is about $150,000. So the Twin Falls County Sheriff decides to exhume one of the bodies of her husbands. They find that they have traces of arsenic in their bodies. One of them had so much arsenic that it would have been enough to kill 5 men. She had most likely been poisoning their food using arsenic from flypaper. During this time, flypaper used to kill flies contained arsenic. When her home is investigated, there are white rings around some of the pots, pans, and bowls, and this is what connects them to her using arsenic. It's important to note that Lia was labeled a femme fatale during her time. She was incredibly charismatic, that even during her trial, the husband that she had been married to for a very brief time, who had also just taken out a $10,000 life insurance policy, stood by her side and defended her. However, she is found guilty. She's charged with murder in the 2nd degree, and she's sentenced to 10 years, minimum of 10 years, maximum to life in 1921. So I do really quickly want to talk about why she's charged with murder in the 2nd degree. There are a couple reasons for this, but the biggest regarding women painting with a broad brush is that when anyone is charged with murder in the 1st degree, they face the death penalty. Idaho did not like the idea of having a woman face the death penalty, so they did it a lesser crime, murder in the 2nd degree, while she is still serving a minimum of 10 years, maximum of life here at the penitentiary. So, about 10 years into her sentence, Lia, due to good behavior, is given more privileges. With this, she gets to work in the yard of the women's ward, tending to the roses. Here, she meets a male trustee named Charles Minton. The 2 of them hatch a plan to escape together. Minton decides to build her a rose lattice. The warden even helps to deliver the lattice to Lia, while Minton smuggles in a hacksaw. The plan is that Lia will use the hacksaw to cut down the bars of her cell, and then escape by using the rose lattice as a ladder, and then climb over the wall where Minton will be waiting for her on the other side. Minton is about to be released as soon as they're hatching this plan. According to Minton, Lia had promised to marry him once they escaped. However, they do soon split ways in Colorado. Lia gets married to another man, but knows that Minton is close behind her trail, wanting to cash in on the $500 reward for her capture. So she decides to Lia decides to go to California to visit her mother. Here she sends a letter to her husband where she purposefully writes her name and her address, knowing that this is how the police will catch her. After about 13 months in total of escaping, she's brought back to the penitentiary where she serves out the rest of her sentence. She does not get any additional time added to her sentence. After another 10 years, she is pardoned. This kind of comes as a result from her sister writing to the warden. The warden, her sister claims that she's now 51 years old. She's lost her girlish charm, so she's no longer going to be a threat to men. Therefore, I think that she has served a good portion of her sentence and she should be released. So she is given a pardon. The two rules she must follow upon her parole is that she must live with her sister and she must not exploit her story for any fame for at least 6 months. This is because her story had gained national attention, so they wanted to ensure that she was not going to sell her story. She served just under 20 years in total after killing 4 husbands, her daughter, her brother-in-law, and she's released at 51 years old. So after she was released from the penitentiary, the warden ensured that the 2 barn cats that she had adopted would be sent home to her. She named these 2 barn cats Patty and Sorrel. And by all accounts, like I've mentioned before, she was a charming and charismatic woman. Some say that she had a hypnotic personality. The warden's daughter, Bess Cuddy, once spoke regarding both the cats and Lida's personality. She says,
"She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, 'Kitty, kitty, kitty,' and those cats would go to her. So I don't know what her power was, but it was something that was hypnotic to handle those animals."
So the women's ward closes in 1968. After that, women who committed crimes in Idaho were moved out of state to serve their sentences. In the 81 years that women served time here, 217 women would be sentenced here to the penitentiary. Their crimes varied dramatically, and they faced many challenges both inside and outside the prison because of their genders. They committed crimes similar to men, however, their treatment remained unique to their genders. On behalf of the Idaho State Historical Society, I thank you all for joining us tonight. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you guys. I have reserved some time for questions. I'm more than happy to answer any questions regarding our women tonight. Yeah.
How many women are currently incarcerated in Idaho State Prison System?
That's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if somebody else does, but I don't know. That number has significantly grown. So women would have been moved outside to like Nevada or Colorado, and then brought back to the facility.
Where are they currently held in Idaho now?
The CUNA facility. It's out in CUNA. Yeah, there's going to be a facility for women out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Did any women die while they were incarcerated in this site?
Yeah. So did any woman die during their incarceration here? No, not from records that we have. No. Really good question. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You're awesome. Yeah, Emily?
How were women punished differently than men?
Okay, yeah, so how were women punished differently than men? So this is regarding punishments during their time here. This might include what we see just right outside solitary confinement. So women who were here, who were being punished while they were serving time, they would have been sent down to the county courthouse. This is where they would serve their solitary confinement there. So great question.
Yeah. You're very obviously passionate about like female incarceration, so I'm just curious what led you to that? Do you have some personal experience?
Yes, great question. So I'm studying history. I've always studied incarceration, whether that be present or historical. Mostly when I got here, it was really easy to kind of find a spot to do this. This offered me so many great resources. Working with the people here, I was able to really flourish in this research. I would say the thing that connects me the most to it is just being a woman, being able to connect with them just on that level, being able to understand maybe not their experiences, maybe not their actions, but as a woman. So I've always been fascinated by that. Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
I noticed the inmate number changed pretty drastically. You said there's about 217 women over the
Yes.
career of that penitentiary. So was it pretty uncommon for people to be convicted? Like, was it like a surprising thing? Like, oh,
There's a woman here. It definitely depends on the time that we're discussing. If we're talking 1890s to about 1920s, I would say yes. I wouldn't say shocking, but it definitely wasn't as common. As the years go on, into the 50s and 60s, it did definitely become
and then to carry on with that, so this ward, you were saying the one ward had could house about 16 women. Was it ever over capacity? Like at any point, was it ever like 30 women?
Great question. So that's really funny that you asked that. So we have many documents. This is something that Anthony and I were trying to figure out earlier, and we didn't have a good enough answer, so I just didn't talk about it. So I'm glad that you brought it up. So according to Lulu Rowan, the matron, the interview that she had done in the 80s, she claims that during her time there, so from 1961 to 1967, she was in charge of matron to 20 women at one time. Samuel, he had also mentioned that according to records, at one point there was 25 women here. These are all difficult to fully understand if this is true or not. So this is something that we're still fine-tuning. This is something that I mentioned earlier. There are still many mysteries here, not only for the site, but especially for the women's ward. So that is something that is still we're still fine-tuning, but there certainly may have been times like that.
Where'd they house the women after the riot?
Oh, so great question. So the 1973 riot? Great. So women would have actually been moved out of the facility in 1968. So they left prior to the riot. Really great question, though. So women who were charged in Idaho would be sent down to Nevada to serve their time here. So women weren't here past 1968.
And how long were they in Nevada for?
I believe up until the mid-70s when the official women's ward was built out in Kuna. And then women who were incarcerated would be sent to Kuna instead of out of state during that time. Yeah.
Oh, do you know if there are any women that are still living that were ever incarcerated here?
Yeah, so great question. I don't know specifically. However, since women were housed here all the way up until 1968, it's very likely that women that serve time here are still alive. We don't have much interviews with people that serve time here, let alone the women, but it's very likely, that women are still alive. Yeah.
You said that mothers were often incarcerated. Would they ever allow visitation?
Yeah, so great question. Sorry, I think that's a good question. Yes, yeah. So women were applied the same visitation guidelines as the men, which is about once a month they'd be allowed visitors. Women who gave birth during the facility, though, often were not allowed. The children were never allowed to come into the actual women's ward, especially after they gave birth, but they would sometimes have like a 2-week pardon where women who had given birth were allowed to be in the hospital for 2 weeks. That's not applied to every woman, though. Some women were given that pardon, some women weren't. Yeah.
Were the prison guards for the women female, or were they all male?
Yeah, so the majority of the guards here were male. Matrons were a really big part of the facility. They were women that worked here. We did have 2 guards, female guards, that worked here here at the penitentiary. The majority, though, would have been male. But like I said, matrons were like the biggest support system for the women. They kind of functioned on all systems. They would have been the counselor as well as the guard for the women during the day. Yeah, perfect. Do we have any more?
Was it Ida, how she conspired the male trustee to escape prison? Was there much interaction between the female ward and the male ward at all? Was there any, did they have they ever have spent some time together?
Yeah. Great question. I'm just gonna keep, all of your questions are great, actually. I'm just gonna say that now. It's a ploy. I say great questions so I can think. So there would be very, very limited interaction. So I didn't mention this, but Lulu Rowan, another thing that women would do during their time to spend their days is sunbathe. So they would go out into the yard and they would sunbathe. However, she was very strict that they could not be on the west side of the facility since that was closest to the male trustee dorm. So they did their best to prohibit any interactions between the male residents and the female residents. However, it does happen. For Lida's case with Charles Benton, definitely with Josie Kersler, Ida Laherty, Susie Duffy, who were serving time in the same facility. Since the women ward was built, though, the interactions between the men and women were very limited.
Was there a mess hall, or were they in their individual cells?
Yeah, so they had a kitchen inside the women's ward. Yes, yeah, so women would be assigned A weeks and B weeks. A weeks, the women who were assigned to this would cook. They would be responsible for the cleaning, the cooking, and then B week, the women were not. They just did their own thing. So they would kind of switch off who was A week, who was B week, but women were responsible for cooking themselves. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Were they responsible for cooking for the men also?
No. Great question. Great question. I'm going to stop saying it because now there's a whole group right here. So no, definitely not. The male residents were responsible for their own cooking in the dining hall. Yes. Yeah. Do we have any more questions?
You're so great.
Thank you. You guys, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, yeah.
You mentioned typing. Were there other opportunities for the women to work throughout the years?
So to earn a wage, like the men who were like in the cannery, they'd be kind of given, they'd work for a wage. Not so much for the women. Very little, very little. The only thing that I've been able to find in my research has been washing the clothes of the guards. They'd get 15 cents for long sleeve, 10 cents for short sleeve. Anything else, though, I haven't found anything else to support that idea. They couldn't come, exactly, yes, yeah. So there's kind of that idea. Likewise with vocational training, it certainly did happen, but it was not necessarily heavily instituted by the facility here. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any violence, women violence in the women's ward? Like, injuries?
Yeah. You guys are a great crowd. So yes, certainly. There would have been either verbal or physical arguments between the women. I have yet to find anything that would have resulted in serious physical damage or, yeah, so certainly. Lulu Rowan also discusses this. She mentions that most of the time she would work as the mediator in situations like this. She actually discusses one time that these two women were kind of at odds with each other for an unknown reason, and they had gotten in a physical altercation. So she sent both of them down to solitary confinement at the county courthouse. Goodness. And then after that, when they came back, they were friends again. So, so very little. But yes, certainly there certainly would have been like physical altercations or verbal. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I have so many questions. So you had mentioned earlier in your presentation that a lot of the crimes that the women committed kind of pushed off and dismissed as, oh, that one's crazy. Was there any sort of like psychiatric evaluation or treatment done to your penitentiary? Yeah, like understanding that there was, in this time period, there was a lot of kind of pseudoscience revolving around women's health.
Great. Awesome question. that is something that I don't have much research on. We do certainly know that pseudoscience may have been applied here. This isn't related to the women, but we do have a young man who served time here who was pretty aggressive and pretty had a short temper, and they thought that his dental hygiene had something to do with that. This is according to the time here, so it kind of depends on what the advancements are. Regarding the women, though, I don't think I have enough research to really give a good answer for that.
Describe them with hysteria or something.
Not from what I've researched, but that is something that I will have to do more research on to get a really good answer for you. Yeah. For the next one. Yeah.
This is something that you answered in your presentation, but I thought it was interesting. That one woman who whipped
Alta.
She was sleeping with her husband,
Yes.
or was being flaunted in front of her. She only got fined for the whipping. Did she get punished for the attempted shooting?
Oh yes. She's charged with assault with a deadly weapon. Yes. Yeah. Yes, she's given a $5 fine for the assault, and she is sentenced to time here at the penitentiary for that attempted murder. Great, I'm glad you asked that, because I would hate if you walked away thinking that she didn't get any time for that. Yes.
You talked about when the women, I think you said there were 2 to each cell in the women's ward, and then the one that had, I guess, seniority would sleep in the day room. Yeah. Do you know why that was?
Yeah, so in the 60s, they would have had a radio. They would have had access to the kitchen and whatnot. So being out there kind of offered them a little bit more freedom. So it was a little bit nicer than being locked up in a cell. You did have access to the day room, the radio and whatnot. So that's kind of why, yeah. Yeah.
Did they have free range throughout the day, or were they locked into their cells at certain period times,
Great question. Awesome question. Cool question. I'm like, I need more adjectives. Yes, so women would be locked, they would have access to the yard, but they would, in fact, at 8 p.m., they'd be locked into their cells, and then they'd be let out in the morning. But between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., they would have access to the yard, to the women's yard and to the ward.
Yeah. There's a building down on Warm Springs. I think it's Warm Springs Counseling now, but on the top it says Boise Children's Home. Is that the one that you were talking about?
Yes. Yeah, that would, yeah. Yeah, it would just be right down the road. Yes, yeah. But yeah, you're right. It's Boise Counseling now, but that would be where children were held. Not only that, it was not specifically for children of people who were incarcerated. It was for, just for foster home of sorts. Yeah.
So one of the things you mentioned was that instead of being sent to solitary confinement at the penitentiary, women were sent to the courthouse, right? Mm-hmm. Was that considered worse or more bad? How was the solitary confinement at the courthouse? Did they just have
it's like a separate room. It is, I would not compare it to Siberia or the cooler on site here. I would say they're pretty different in how they're built in the inside. However, the same rules kind of would apply. So they'd be given one blanket. They'd be fed 3 times a day. It kind of depends on who you might ask regarding which one is better or worse. I have actually never seen what the solitary confinements would look like. I have seen what these look like, and these are pretty difficult conditions to be in. So I don't have too much research to be able to really tell you. But the reason women were housed or put in solitary confinement over there is just to limit that interaction of women inside the men's ward here. It's a good question, because I want to find out more about it. Yeah. Perfect. Do we have any more questions? I'm wondering how good we are on time. Good. Okay, perfect. So if there are any more questions, feel free. But if not, I guess this is it then. Yeah, awesome.